So I've got three different organs or organ systems here. The skeleton provides our body structure and support. The heart, part of the circulatory cardiovascular system that pumps our blood to the rest of our body. And then perhaps the one that makes the least sense, the brain. Now, if you look at these three, it's pretty easy to figure out what these two do, right? These are rigid, strong bones meant to protect and stabilize. This is a bunch of tubes, right, and muscle that pumps. So if something goes wrong, you break a femur, let's say, we can empathize with people because we say, oh, I see your femur, it's broken, that makes sense, you can't walk, you have my empathy or sympathy. And even to the heart to some extent, right? Oh, we get that. Oh, you've got a problem with one of these coronary arteries or something's gone wrong with your aorta here. Blood's not getting pumped to where it needs to be. That makes sense. But for some people with mental health issues, something's maybe going on up here. And what is this? This just looks like a massive goo. Like it's hard to tell what's going on there. So in this video, I want to explain, give you some of the biology, some of the physiology of what's going on with mental health conditions in the brain, and perhaps give you an opportunity or maybe further your understanding to give people a little more empathy when perhaps they have a mental health issue. Let's get started. So we can't really talk about the brain without talking about the cells of the brain, which would be the neuron. The neuron is the cell that makes up our nervous system, and it looks like this. If you look here, we've got some little dendrites. These receive information. Then we have the cell body here, the center of the cell, and then this long axon here covered in these protective myelin sheath that sends information away from the cells. Now, what you may know is that at the end of these neurons, there's a little space before it gets to the next neuron. So I want to talk about that as a way of information processing and things that happen in the brain. So just to remember, the dendrite receives information, sends it down through the cell body, down the axon to another neuron. A lot of this process is electrical because we have a voltage that's moving through these neurons. Okay? And structure fits function here, right? We got lots of tiny little fingers to get the information, but we have one long axon there to send the information away. All right, so here's a few types of neurons so that we can understand what's going on, right? If I sense something, I see it, I smell it, we have sensory neurons, take that information from the outside world, and then they're going to convey them. They receive the information through the dendrites, goes through this cell body, and then down the axon to perhaps another interneuron. Think inter between, right? And then if we want like some muscle movement or something, some motor to happen, there might be a motor neuron attached, right? So I see something, I see a snake maybe. Then that information needs to get processed through my body, through the neurons, to the motor neurons that say, hey, muscle, move, right? Motor, get going, get away from that snake, okay? So these are a few types of neurons and how they function. Like I said here, this motor neuron in this case might be attached to these muscles. Hey legs, let's get going, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the end, where that axon meets the new cell. This could be a neuron, it could be a muscle cell. This is called the synapse or the synaptic space. So you can see this big space right there. The neurons aren't actually touching. This neuron doesn't touch this neuron. There's this space in between. So what happens is this voltage moves down. Remember, I told you there was electricity. So this voltage moves down one neuron. When it gets to the end, when this action potential, this voltage gets down here to the end, it opens up some calcium channels. So here's some calcium channels getting opened. The calcium then flows in. That calcium then causes these neurotransmitter vesicles, remember that word, to bind to the synaptic membrane, release those neurotransmitters into the synapse, and then they go across and they go into a postsynaptic neuron. This could be a postsynaptic neuron. Obviously, this would be the presynaptic neuron, because this is before, this is after, pre, post. So what happens is, in this postsynaptic neuron, these neurotransmitters get transmitted, right, that's why they're called neurotransmitters, across the synaptic space, and then there's the receptor proteins in the next neuron. Then those will be activated, maybe some ions flow in, depending on what kind of receptor it is, if it's voltage gated or receptor tyrosine kinase, G protein linked receptors. There's lots of different receptors. And depending on how it works, ions might flow in or something else. Now, at the end, these neurotransmitters, right, they've been in this space, they either need to be degraded, break them down, or they need to be reabsorbed back into the presynaptic neuron. So why have I gone into such detail about this? Because this is the source of many mental health issues, at least the biological source. These neurotransmitters are a weak link in this otherwise pretty good system of neural transmission. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this video is talk about these neurotransmitters and how they affect what particular mental health conditions they may attribute to, and perhaps some ways of alleviating that through drugs that either mimic or replace some of these neurotransmitters. So, speaking of neurotransmitters, I want to talk about 3 big ones and then another one that we might see here. So, if you look here, I'm starting with GABA, which is not over here in my nice little diagram. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. And this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if you think something that inhibits, it's going to inhibit the neuronal excitability. So if your neurons are getting excited, this GABA, this neurotransmitter, will inhibit that excitability of those neurons. Okay. So I want to then mention these 3 that are over here as well. Epinephrine, which also you may call adrenaline, and norepinephrine are involved in the body's fight or flight response, okay? So if you look here, norepinephrine, there's the chemical structure of norepinephrine. And this is, right, it's the fight or flight response, concentration, attention, right? A lot of this is involved with the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So if there are problems with some of these things, right, mood, attention, concentration, there might be an issue with norepinephrine. Dopamine, we commonly think of as that reward neurotransmitter. It's all about, we get a little jolt of dopamine, our body feels rewarded, and we continue doing the thing that gave us that jolt of dopamine, right? So this is often involved also in a lot of addictions. So dopamine, we think alertness, clarity, memory. Here's the chemical structure of that dopamine molecule. Now, if you kind of notice, if you're just looking at these chemical structures, right? Here we've got a ring, we've got sort of a long chain of carbons with an amino group at the end. These are pretty similar if you just are kind of looking at them, right? Got some hydroxyl groups there. Dopamine and norepinephrine, right, are very close in terms of chemical structure, but they actually do a few different things in terms of function. Serotonin is the one down here, right? It's a little different than the others. You've got this sort of double ring structure here. And serotonin we think of as sort of the happy neurotransmitter, right? If you have depression or if you have constant insomnia or sleepiness, maybe even some anxiety, that might be linked to serotonin. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this Venn diagram is that all of these together, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, affect balance and mood, right? So for mental health disorders, mood disorders, it's tricky because many of these neurotransmitters contribute to it. So it's finding the right balance, the right chemical imbalance perhaps, to know how to treat some of these issues. Okay, so I mentioned neurotransmitters are the weak point of our nervous system because any substance that either affects or mimics will affect our nerve function. And as we know, our nerve function is us. We are our brain. Your brain is you. So when we are affecting our nerves, our neurons, you are affecting your core, the person you are. So a very popular thing that, in fact, either mimics, blocks, or reabsorbs these neurotransmitters is something called an SSRI. And so an SSRI is something called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Now, I mentioned to you that serotonin, right, was maybe that you think of as the happiness neurotransmitter. Now, it does many more things, but that's sort of what you think of when you think of serotonin. So if we have a drug, which is an SSRI, what this drug does is it inhibits the reuptake of serotonin. Remember I told you that these neurotransmitters, so here's serotonin right there, are released, they go across, they bind to the receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, right? And this process, right, still very complicated and hard to understand, over time results in sort of these feelings of happiness or helps modulate sleepiness and tiredness. So if we can limit the reuptake, meaning instead of this serotonin going back into here, we limit it. So it blocks these neurotransmitters, in this case serotonin, from going back in. Therefore, what do? They just keep bonding again to these receptors. And somehow that, right, miraculously gives us more feelings of happiness or less anxiety, less depression. Okay, and so you can sort of see here, I put the pathway of how this serotonin actually works, and you can see it's widespread through the brain. So when we are doing anything and modulating serotonin, we're really doing a lot in the brain, particularly down here, parts of the limbic system, which we know are responsible for emotion. Okay, now I talked about SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But there are actually inhibitors for the other neurotransmitters that I mentioned as well. So this chart's kind of tricky, but I think it's a brilliant chart because it shows you the overlap. So if you look here, let's just start with the easy one. Dopamine inhibitors, right? Amphenolic acid inhibits dopamine. But if you look up here, the noradrenaline inhibitors are here, okay? And maybe you've heard of some of these drugs. That's the drug is the thing in parentheses at the end. But notice that, for example, cocaine, all right, or we've picked cocaine here, is a dopamine inhibitor. It's also in this noradrenaline inhibitor. And then if you look here, it also is a serotonin transport inhibitor. So cocaine does it all. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting you take the cocaine. Methamphetamines, amphetamines, a drug called Xanarex, these inhibit a lot of these neurotransmitter transports, okay? So that's why these are such powerful drugs, and they really mess with your brain. But I want you to notice a few here. Some that you've perhaps heard of, right? Maybe you've heard of Effexor, Cymbalta, maybe you've heard of the drug. You've probably also heard of some of these down here, which are just serotonin ones, right? Prozac, which is fluoxetine. Cipralex Zoloft, you've probably heard of, which is sertraline, excuse me. These are essentially, when you think of mental health drugs, many of them are these transporter inhibitors, okay? So that's how they work. They work by inhibiting transport. And as I showed you here, I've already showed you this image, they basically block, in the case of SSRIs, the reuptake of some of these neurotransmitters. All right, so want to talk now about the diseases. I've talked a lot of biology, a lot of neuroscience. Let's talk about some of the disorders. Neuropsychiatric disease, mental health disorder, accounts for about 14% of disease, right? Which is a lot, right? And in a sobering statistic, 1 million people die by suicide each year globally. That is crazy. 1 million people by suicide globally. Many of those, of course, linked to mental health disorders. So if you watched my last video on global health, you may remember we talked about the DALY, the Disability Adjusted Life Year. So if you look across our globe, mental health disorders, and that's any neuropsychiatric condition, is really prominent here in the United States, parts of South America. Less so in other parts of the world. Now, there's many reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into all of that. Some could be access to healthcare, access to diagnosis, but you notice there's a lot of mental health disorders over here in the Americas, North and South America. And if you look, there's a strong correlation to income inequality. So inequality, right? Not equal incomes, and mental illness. So if you look, so countries that are high in income inequality, unfortunately like the United States, right? There's a vast income inequality here. Look at the percent with mental illness. Very high. Places with lower income inequality, right? Japan, Belgium, Germany, seem to have fewer mental illness. Now, I'm not gonna make a statement about that, but I just want you to notice that income inequality does seem to be a contributing factor in mental health disorders. So, what causes this? It's in the brain, right? What causes the brain to change? What causes these chemicals to be imbalanced? Well, there's lots of reasons. Let me go through a few. The one that I am going to talk about the rest of this video is the biological reasons. I'm a biologist. That's what I understand the best. That's what I'm going to talk to you about. So in terms of biology, what's going on in this brain to cause these mental health issues? One could be a chemical imbalance. These neurotransmitters, we don't have the right balance, so maybe we need to take a drug to change that balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. Genetics. We know people with certain mental health issues are more likely to have them if their parents had them, right? If it runs in the family, it's in our genes. Brain injury. We know that injuries, physical injuries to the brain, can actually cause some mental health issues. And then we also know, we're learning more and more, that substance abuse, taking drugs, including, some studies say marijuana, can lead later to, especially if you take them as a young person, can lead to some mental health issues later in life, okay? So those are the biological reasons, and you can see, I just picked dopamine as the neurotransmitter in this one. You can see the pathway of these neurotransmitters throughout the brain, right? So they're affecting many parts of the brain. Okay, so I'm going to focus on biological, but I feel like I should also mention some other causes of mental health issues, and I'll leave these to the social scientists to discuss, but we know some life events are traumatic. Emotional stress can lead to mental health issues. Poor parenting, right? Abuse as a child, neglect as a child. Many people suffer from mental health issues because, right, they had poor parenting, whether that was abuse or neglect, which to me, neglect is also abuse. And then social expectations, right? Especially, I'm not gonna harp on this, but with social media today, the expectations that's put forth by some people that are influencers, these expectations can't possibly be met. That leads to, we think, some mental health issues, okay? So I'm gonna focus the rest of the video on a few mental health issues and what's really going on with these biological changes. So to do this, before we can talk mental health disorders, we have to be able to classify them, right? Because, you know, just because you have a bad day and maybe you're depressed one day doesn't necessarily mean you have full-blown depression, right? Just because you're a little anxious before a test doesn't necessarily mean you might have full-blown anxiety. So we need a way to classify disorders, just like if you were to go to the hospital and you wanted to check to see if you had a certain disease, if you had strep throat, if you had cancer. We need a way to looking and seeing, oh, here's the test, here's the way we classify to see whether or not you have the disorder or disease. So we need to be able, here's the goals, to describe it, to know what these disorders are, predict how it's going to play out, and then, very important, apply the treatment. So how do we do this? If you're a psychologist, if you are a psychiatrist, how do they classify these disorders? Well, there's actually a manual, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Here's the first one that was published in 1952. And we've come a long way since then. And we now have the most recent is the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This describes diseases. It predicts courses may what happen, and in some cases even implies treatment that might be needed for some of these mental health issues. So now I want to give you some categories of disorders, and then I'm going to talk about a few specific ones. So we have several categories of mental health disorders. One is mood disorders. In this category, we have major depressive disorder, right? Those people with major depression. And we also have bipolar. Those are people that sort of live at the two poles, right? This has also been called manic depressive, right? There's periods of mania, periods of depression. These two are actually different diseases. They get confused a lot, but they're very different treatments. We also have dissociative disorder. When you think someone's disassociating themselves or their brain's disassociating, we've got some really interesting ones here. Multiple personality disorder. These are people with separate alters, right? They may have one person that's the host in their body, in their brain, and then they have other alters or personalities that might come through. Fugue's a really interesting one. These are people that just pick up, fugue, flee, go to different places, living a different life. Schizophrenic disorders, and I do want to point out, schizophrenia is not the same as multiple personality. A lot of people get these confused, but schizophrenia is specifically about having delusions, often delusions of grandeur, hallucinations. It literally, if you think schits break apart, is sort of splitting of the mind. Anxiety disorders, getting very common. Generalized anxiety disorder, we abbreviate GAD. This is a big, increasingly debilitating disorder, especially in Americas. Phobias, irrational fears of certain things, right? Everybody's maybe afraid of snakes or spiders. But if there is a particular phobia, maybe to aluminum foil, right? That's an irrational fear. So those would be classified as phobias. Then OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. These are people who have certain obsessions. They keep thinking certain things, or certain compulsions. They have to do certain things, flip the light so many times before they leave. Personality disorders, like histrionic, right? If you think of histrionics, that's very like dramatic and theatrical. Some people are very dramatic, right? Now, some of us are dramatic, but that doesn't necessarily mean it meets all the criteria of histrionic disorder. This, you also have borderline narcissistic disorder. Again, these are a little more rare. Their personality, right? You might just attribute, oh, well, that's just their personality. They're dramatic or they're narcissistic. Sometimes, though, these can get pretty excessive. And then I think it's sort of a newer category. It's trauma or stress-related disorders, and that's PTSD, right? Which is post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So I'm going to focus on 3 of these in the rest of the video. All of these are interesting. All of these deserve their own time, but I want to focus on 3 that are really, I think, becoming global health issues. That's major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and then PTSD. So I'm going to talk about each of those as we finalize the video. So I want to start with major depressive disorder. What is it? What is depression? People with major depressive disorder experience prolonged hopelessness and lethargy. Tired, hopeless, and depressed over a prolonged period of time. So, what are some signs of depression? Poor appetite, right? Some people with depression just don't want to eat. They're insomnia. They can't sleep, but they're always tired, lethargy. Feeling of worthlessness. Don't want to go out with friends, family, activities, things they normally or previously would have enjoyed. that they no longer want to do, okay? So these are some signs of depression. And by the way, remember, this has to be prolonged over a long period of time, roughly a year, I think is one of the minimum expectations. So for depressive disorders, what's the daily on this? Well, in the United States, roughly 8.4% of adults have had or are currently having at least 1 year-long depressive disorder, right? That's pretty substantial. And that I think that number might be low. So if you round that up to roughly 10%, you think 1 in 10 people have had an experience with a year-long depressive disorder. So what's going on? As I mentioned before, many people think this is linked to serotonin in the brain. So one common drug, of course, are these SSRIs. Zoloft, also known as sertraline, that's an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it doesn't necessarily allow these serotonin molecules to be reuptook into the presynaptic neuron. Prozac, right? You've probably heard about that. That's also an SSRI. There are also some other drugs we could use. Effexor, right? Which it goes, these top ones are, of course, the brand name. These are the actual drug names. Venlafaxine is an SNRI. So if you remember back to that little diagram that I showed, it's sort of like a Venn diagram that showed that many of these neurotransmitter inhibitors kind of overlap. Well, this is an SNRI, meaning this blocks the reuptake of both serotonin and norepinephrine. So you're sort of getting two neurotransmitters that are affected by Effexor. Okay, so that's major depressive disorder. All right, let's talk about generalized anxiety disorder. And I mentioned to you that this gets abbreviated GAD a lot, generalized anxiety disorder. This is excessive, uncontrollable, and often irrational worry about events. Now, everybody gets anxiety here and there about this, right? Anxiety is what keeps us from walking across a busy highway. But at some points, it's excessive, uncontrollable, and irrational. People worrying about things that actually don't make sense. So, what are the signs of anxiety? Excessive worry, worry. Insomnia, can't sleep. Restlessness, right? Always feeling like even though they're tired, they may be irritable or restless. They need to get up and move. Sweating is a sign of anxiety. Sometimes that's also linked to some of the drugs that help anxiety. And also trembling, right? Anxiety disorders, panic attacks can be classified in sort of this general anxiety category as well. So, what's going on with GAD, generalized anxiety disorder? Some studies have shown that individuals with GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, have greater amygdala and medial prefrontal cortex activation in response to stimuli. So, when you get a stimuli, you see something or you experience something, right? Parts of the limbic system here react. That's how our brain reacts to these stimuli. Well, we think with generalized anxiety disorder, there's greater reaction from the amygdala and medial prefrontal cortex than there should be, right? So people with anxiety are often overreacting to a stimuli because the brain, the parts of the brain that react to that, are actually overreacting. So what are some ways to deal with anxiety? So remember, of course, I am talking about drugs. I'm talking about biology. There are therapies to deal with a lot of these, but as a biologist, I'm going to focus on some of the drugs, the biology. So escitalopram is an SSRI that is often used to help people with generalized anxiety disorder. It affects serotonin in the brain. Also, like we just mentioned, Effexor is an SNRI, which seems to be pretty effective against generalized anxiety disorder as well. One that probably you've heard of, which is much stronger and has many more complications, is Xanax. Xanax is in the category of benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are highly addictive, and they work for some people, right? So Xanax, which, is in society as something, it's sort of got its own meme, basically. So how does this work? How does Xanax work? As I mentioned, it's a benzodiazepine, and benzodiazepines work by binding to GABA receptors. You may remember I talked earlier that GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the main or the chief inhibitory neurotransmitter. Well, this benzodiazepine works, specifically Xanax, works as being a positive allosteric modulator to this GABA receptor, meaning it makes the GABA receptor work better. So, since GABA is an inhibitor and benzodiazepine helps GABA, that means, so this reduces neuronal excitability, right? So instead of your neurons getting excited and anxious all the time, these benzodiazepines work by helping GABA do more of its job and lowering that neuronal excitability.